This is a land where water doesn't linger at all. No proper rivers, no lasting lakes, not a single source that could survive the local heat. All of this is Nevada, a state that gets only 7 inches of rain per year. And even that never manages to soak the soil. Everything here evaporates faster than it hits the ground. But right now, the state might finally get something it hasn't had in millions of years. A $16 billion project claims it can pull Pacific Ocean water into Nevada and turn a handful of parched valleys into new lakes. The plan relies on everything that already exists: old canals, dry corridors, ancient channels, and then layers another 500 miles of new canals, pipes, and aqueducts on top. When the project becomes operational, up to 1,500 square miles will show up on the map. That's not just lakes anymore, it's a full inland sea slicing the desert in two. But there's one problem engineers don't like to talk about. Because you can't just take ocean water, haul it over mountains, and drown part of a state as if it's some routine construction job. So let's look at what exactly the state's trying to create, and why this project carries a risk no one saw coming. Wet West. The history of the American West doesn't look like the settlement of a territory. It looks like a giant attempt to rewrite everything from scratch. Engineers here weren't building roads, they were trying to change the climate. On maps, straight canal lines cut across deserts as if someone genuinely believed they could subdue an entire continent and force rivers to flow where they had never flowed before. Today's Nevada is not just casinos and desert. During the mid-1900s, it was among the states most vocal about water needs. So vocal, in fact, that the state was ready to sign on to almost every major river diversion project that was even being discussed at the time. The most famous of them was the North American Water and Power Alliance, or NARWAPA for short. The name sounds like a classified program from the Cold War era. And in terms of scale, it was almost exactly that. In the 1960s, the Parsons Corporation produced a feasibility study that, in all seriousness, described a system of 369 components: dams, pumping stations, canals, tunnels, and what would have been the tallest planned reservoir in the world. The idea was insane. Take water from the rivers of Alaska and British Columbia, haul it across the Rockies, and send it down through the entire West, into 35 U.S. states, and even northern Mexico. For Nevada, where everything evaporates faster than it appears, this was a proposal on the level of a new era. If NAWAPA had been launched, the state would have received so much water that it could literally expand cities, start large-scale agriculture, and build neighborhoods in places where today there's only rock and sand. To give you an idea of the scale, the projected length of the entire system was 8,000 miles. That's like the distance from London to Beijing, except here we're talking about infrastructure for water. But NAWAPA collapsed under its own weight. Its price tag, about $100 billion in 1960s money, was impossible for that era. Canada had no intention of giving up its rivers. Environmentalists began protesting before the project was even approved. And this entire giant engineering machine remained on paper, a monument to an era when people believed they could prevail over geography. But NAWAPA wasn't the only hydrological aspiration. Throughout the 20th century, engineers kept trying again and again to find extra water on the map and pull it into the deserts of the Southwest. The Columbia River is one such example. There was an idea to build trunk canals to literally move part of the Pacific Northwest into Nevada, Arizona, and California. Not as massive a scheme as NAWAPA, but quite specific and often discussed. The Mississippi River was another thing people fantasized about. People imagined it as a liquid conveyor belt, taking as much water as you need, pump it west, turn the Great Plains and deserts into oases. There were pump layouts, canal models, and dozens of irrigation calculations. But all these plans ended the same way: colossal costs, political conflicts, ecological risks, interstate disputes, and yet another project went into the folder called Maybe One Day. Nevada, meanwhile, was always first in line, always waiting for the next project to launch, but every time, nothing happened. This is how an entire historical collection formed. Blueprints, calculations, ambitions, decades of discussions, and not a single real water breakthrough. And due to this long chain of failures, at some point it became clear the old pour the north into the south strategy no longer works. Too expensive, too slow, too many political barriers. But in the 21st century, the West got a new plan. A plan that doesn't require hauling water across half a continent. A plan that proposes taking water straight from the Pacific Ocean and sending it into Nevada. And this is where the real madness begins. Reality is closer than it seems. The idea seems simple. Take water straight from the Pacific Ocean and send it to Nevada. But in reality, things are much more complicated and much more interesting. First, water is taken on the California coast. But seawater is useless. It's salty and can't be used for anything. That's why large desalination plants are placed right on the shoreline. They run on the most widespread technology in the world, reverse osmosis. Salty water is pushed through membranes under pressure, the salt stays inside, and fresh water comes out the other side. No magic, just clean water that can be used to fill reservoirs, canals, and lakes. But getting fresh water is only half the job. Then comes the main question: where and how do you send it? The southern route starts with systems like All-American and Coachella. The idea is simple. Desalinated water flows in, and in exchange, Nevada receives the volumes that were supposed to go down the Colorado. This isn't some giant pipe stretching across the desert. It's a redistribution of the flows already moving inside infrastructure that's maintained every single day. The eastern route runs through the Mojave Valley along its old, long, dry riverbed. From there, the water climbs through the Amargosa Valley and comes out right at Nevada's border. Key points are reinforced with pumping stations. The flow can run year-round and is strong enough to move millions of tons a year. Inside Nevada, the water spreads through the dried basins of ancient lakes, playas. These are natural reservoirs perfectly positioned below the surrounding terrain. Amargosa, Reese, Big Smoky, Monitor, all of these valleys are literally waiting to be filled. The primary corridor could go alongside US 95, where utilities and roads are already built. This reduces construction costs and turns the project from deep engineering into modernizing what's already there. That's how dry depressions become a network of natural reservoirs, where part of the water sinks into the ground, part evaporates, and the rest moves further through the system. That's how a system is built. 500 miles of new canals plus 1,000 miles of natural channels. The result is 695 square miles of irrigated land and more than 965 square miles of water surface in the middle of the desert. Places that were once nothing but rocks and salt become green. Agriculture gets a chance in areas where it was once impossible. The soils of the Big Smoky or Reese valleys were always suitable, they simply never had water. But where do you get the energy for all this? Desalination and pumping requires enormous amounts of megawatts. For example, lifting 317 billion gallons to an elevation of 3,300 feet takes around 6 gigawatts. And Nevada is full of small hills and ridges, meaning the system faces a lot of elevation-related issues. But the people behind the project propose a simple solution: solar power. Both California and Nevada are literally covered in sunlight. California already has 47 gigawatts of solar capacity, more than any other state in the U.S. Nevada's at 8.1 gigawatts, with growth expected up to 11 gigawatts. In other words, the state that needs the water also happens to have the resource capable of producing and lifting it. The economics of desalination with solar energy look like this. Modern reverse osmosis plants and batteries are already cheap enough, and the price of solar panels keeps falling. This is very good news, and it's drawing serious attention from everyone connected to the initiative. At the same time, the spending for a mega project of this size, around $16 billion, doesn't even look that overwhelming. About $4 billion goes to 20 gigawatts of solar panels, $4 billion to the reverse osmosis plant, $6 billion to canals, and $2 billion to pumps and power systems. And even now, people are already saying that the huge advantage is that, in the long run, a desalination plant sending this water to Nevada could easily generate enormous added value thanks to irrigated farmland, lakes, and new zones for real estate and agriculture. The economic boost is measured in the trillions of dollars. At this point, a logical question comes up. If it's also reasonable, efficient, and profitable, why isn't the project already being built? And that's where things get really interesting. Thing is, the took the water, desalinated it, poured it into the desert scheme comes with huge downsides that people usually keep quiet about. Can't ignore this. Let's sum up the conditions in which this massive water project is supposed to happen. In Nevada, water goes into the sky faster than a person can even register that it was ever there. The heat is such that any open body of water breathes steam almost year-round. In summer, the ground is burned through, winter's cold but dry, and together this adds up to colossal losses. If you pour water into a wide, shallow bowl of desert, it disappears in layers, as if someone were secretly draining it. In the flat depressions, those very playas, evaporation's especially intense. The sun clings to the water surface all day, and every gallon vanishes almost imperceptibly. Unlike many other flashy projects, they're not disregarding this part of the project. Here they openly say, "We know about the problem," and acknowledge that it's truly enormous. If you send water into the desert, some of it will inevitably disappear. What to do about it? Well, there are a few ideas. First, no one intends to keep the lakes filled to the brim like a bathtub. Water levels will shift with the seasons. If the surface area is smaller, the sun will evaporate less water. Playas aren't turned into giant mirrors forever. In some places, the water recedes deeper. In others, it lingers in narrower spots where there's less wind. The system of lakes and channels will be dynamic, and that way, the desalinated water gets a better chance of surviving the high evaporation environment. Second, it's all about the shape of the basins. If the water's allowed to occupy only the deeper sections instead of spreading across the whole surface, the losses go down. Shade from the slopes, steeper edges, all of this helps the water make it to the night, to the next morning, without vanishing to the last drop. There's also the idea that even if water seeps into the ground, it still benefits Nevada. When liquid percolates through the flat bottom, it doesn't evaporate nearly as fast. The subsurface becomes a storage tank, hidden from the sun. It's like tucking water beneath a thin layer of sand so that no one but the earth sees it. And the project explicitly states some water must go into the soil because down there it lasts longer than it does on the surface. In the end, the playa works not like a pool that heats up and vents steam into the sky, but like a sponge, losing water from the top, but holding onto it inside. There's yet another major issue: the desalination plants themselves, the centerpiece of the whole project. A facility that forces seawater through membranes and squeezes out the salt always looks impressive on paper. But behind that lies something significant. For every ton of fresh water, you're left with about half a ton of thick, heavy brine. It's a concentrate packed not only with salts, but with traces of practically the entire periodic table. The project team understands this, and therefore doesn't pretend that the brine can simply be put somewhere. There's no familiar dump it far away and forget it scheme. Quite the opposite. The brine is treated as ore, an unlikely resource that usually gets thrown away. They like to use a blunt but accurate comparison. We're producing not only water, but a liquid mine. And then they start listing lithium, magnesium, boron, rare earth elements. All of them are in the brine, dissolved. And in some cases, their concentration is higher than in certain deposits mined on land. To prove this isn't fantasy, they point to the Salton Sea, that dead sulfur-scented lake in California, born at the crossroads of geology, greed, and technological optimism. There, geothermal plants have long been pulling hot brine from underground reservoirs, cooling it, and extracting lithium. When engineers talk about it, you can hear something odd in their voices, a blend of pride and fatigue. Because getting every gallon of brine is like working with a valuable but very moody resource. Today, everything runs smoothly. Tomorrow, some deposits clog the pipes. The next day, the chemistry suddenly shifts. But the lithium keeps flowing, and there's a lot of it. It's the Salton Sea. That became the project's key argument. If a functioning extraction cycle can be built there amid hydrogen sulfide fumes, then here, all the more so. Kuwait also conducted experimental studies aimed at extracting valuable minerals like magnesium from spent reverse osmosis brine, and notably, those experiments were successful. Again, they point to the economics. As we've said, a desalination plant is fairly expensive, but if you build a mineral extraction module into it, the system starts to behave differently. A small but steady revenue stream appears, one that, as they put it, will soften operating costs. Yes, it sounds dry, but essentially it means the plant will be able to pay part of its own bills. The brine becomes a commodity rather than a waste. It stops being discarded and instead gets treated as ore that must be handled patiently and carefully. When they talk about the technical side of the project, everything comes down to numerous stages. First comes concentration, then selective crystallization, then sorbents, then purification. The words aren't complicated, but behind them lie several acres of concrete basins, metal heated by the sun, and the smell of wet mineral that vaguely resembles beach sand, only without the sea. In Nevada, they take such things more easily because decades have taught people to look at the land as a resource. Anything works as long as you can extract value from what's under your feet. There's another example they like to recall, the old evaporation ponds on the salt flats where potash is extracted. There, huge colorful mirrors of water are spread under the sun to slowly cook minerals, leaving behind bright crusts of salt. It's not the same process, but the logic is similar. If the climate's on your side, if the chemistry is stubborn but predictable, then you can build production around nature itself. And when they put all of this together, the plant, the pipes, the mineral extraction blocks, what you get is not a perfect scheme and not salvation for the world. It's more of an attempt to work a little more carefully, to avoid making the usual mistake of producing water first and only then wondering what to do with the waste. Here, they want to turn the waste into a commodity, into a stable source of minerals. And that small shift changes the bigger picture. The plant stops looking like a hole through which resources pass and starts to resemble a full-cycle factory, where every drop serves some purpose. However, beyond all this, there are even more serious problems because water, even in water-hungry Nevada, is not always a good thing. No help water. In the Mojave Valley, water has always been a coincidence, a rare guest that shows up after winter storms and disappears just as quickly as it arrived. But according to the project's concept, a river is supposed to flow here again. Not a real one, but water guided through the old, almost fossilized channel of the Mojave River. And that's where the trouble begins. The Mojave's a biome that survives on a fragile balance of dryness. Give it just a little extra moisture and it changes beyond recognition. Soil that's normally loose and sandy suddenly turns into a clay-like mass that barely absorbs water. Grasses appear, including invasive ones, the type that grow fast, like weeds along highways, and then dry out overnight. And dry grass in the desert is effuse. Changes like these have already triggered catastrophic fires in Chihuahua and on the fringes of the Mojave, where grass bombs grew within just a few years next to irrigated fields. If you head farther north toward the Amargosa Valley, things get even worse. Amargosa is an endorheic basin, meaning all water that enters stays inside. It never reaches the sea. Such systems are incredibly sensitive, almost like lab petri dishes set out in the desert. The Amargosa pupfish lives here, a tiny species found only in this place and nowhere else on Earth. Plus freshwater invertebrates that honestly have probably seen humans less often than humans have seen them. If you change the groundwater level, they die. Add salt or reduce seasonal moisture, the ecosystem reorganizes into something else, often much less stable. Yet the project essentially needs to lift water through this area toward Nevada, meaning it has to interfere with the balance that's existed for thousands of years. In this project, Nevada itself is transformed into the land of new lakes. The document proposes flooding playas, those flat salt-crusted basins that look like giant white plates in the desert. On paper, the idea seems logical. Create new bodies of water, generate evaporating surfaces that help form local rainfall, and raise groundwater levels. But playas have one unpleasant trait. They're not just white, layer after layer, they're salty. When they're flooded, the crust softens. Salts begin to migrate, some flow into nearby valleys, some rise to the surface with capillary moisture. After a while, the surface turns into a genuine salt trap, and then the water evaporates, leaving crystals on the ground that the wind lifts into the air, producing dust storms like those at the dry Owens Lake. Heavy metals, salts, alkali, all of it gets carried for dozens of miles. Meanwhile, the project risks creating a huge chain of biological side effects. Any new lake becomes a magnet for invasive fish, brought accidentally by anglers or by equipment. It attracts mosquitoes, including disease-carrying ones. It brings new predators, herons, raccoons, coyotes, drawn to the water and beginning to pressure native desert wildlife. There's one more thing, agriculture. The moment water appears in the desert, people get that spark in their eyes. You can grow anything here, but desert soil plays rough. Salts build up fast. Within 20 to 30 years, yields fall, fields need flushing, cracks appear, and patches form where water simply refuses to soak in. The project suggests handling these risks mostly through organization, through planning where dozens of agencies, companies, and local communities operate as one system. They typically lean on precise flow calculations, gradual basin filling, soil monitoring, and tracking of local fauna. But you know what the upside is? The project's scale is smaller than it seems. As stated, it doesn't even take up half of the massive territory being debated. Most of Nevada remains untouched, supposedly to limit the damage. Yet even with that approach, the engineering has to be as precise as surgery. The desert doesn't like sudden changes. Here, every action echoes for years. And neighboring California already has an example of what human-altered desert water can turn into, the notorious Salton Sea. The sea that was never meant to be. At the beginning of the 20th century, engineers decided that the desert had to play by their rules. Back in 1905, they were laying an irrigation canal from the Colorado River toward the Imperial Valley. Everything was going according to plan until the river decided to play against the rules. Swollen after a powerful flood, it literally tore through an earthen dam and rushed into a gigantic depression, a huge bowl far below sea level. And that's how a new sea appeared on the map, even though no one had planned it. For 2 years, the water flowed non-stop until engineers finally managed to stop the torrent. When the canal was shut off, the sea stayed. At first, people saw it as almost a miracle, basically an accidental gift. A vast water surface around which resorts, marinas, and fishing camps quickly sprang up. In photos from the 1950s, the water glitters like a mirror. Along the shores, there are beaches, yachts, kids with inflatable rings, but back then people had no idea what it would lead to years later. The Salton Sea had neither an outlet nor a permanent inflow. The lake depended on agricultural runoff from the Imperial Valley, essentially leftover irrigation water mixed with pesticides, fertilizers, and salts. Everything that entered the sea stayed there forever. And with every decade, this chemical sludge grew thicker. The desert works like this. If you bring water into it, you pay in full. Evaporation in the California lowland is insane. In summer, temperatures there steadily climb above 113 degrees Fahrenheit. The water vanished into the air. The salts stayed behind. As a result, the lake's salinity grew year after year, surpassing that of the ocean and then doubling it. Fish started to die. At first, just a little, small die-offs, and then on a massive scale. Thousands of dead fish washed up on shore in stinking windrows, and very few people wanted to swim next to that. What used to be a beautiful resort turned into an ecological trap. Algal blooms appeared more and more often. The excess nutrients from fertilizers were fueling their growth. In the heat, anoxic events would kick in. The fish were literally suffocating in their own home. The smell of hydrogen sulfide carried for dozens of miles. The tourist industry disappeared. Towns along the shore lost their value. Houses were selling for pennies. But the real nightmare started later, when the water level began to drop. Reduced agricultural runoff, a new water agreement, drought, all of it cut the inflow. The sea retreated, exposing its bed, which over a century had turned into a mixture of salt, pesticides, selenium, and heavy metals. The wind lifted this into the air, and dust storms made of toxic powder began to appear. The areas around the Salton Sea, home mostly to low-income families, started registering spikes in childhood asthma, chronic lung disease, vision problems. The desert was taking revenge again, not loudly, but methodically. Meanwhile, the ecosystem that had been hanging on thanks to birds, their migratory routes that passed through the Salton Sea, began to collapse. In the past, thousands of birds would stop at the lake. Now the salinity and the stench were making it less and less habitable. Many species could no longer find food or wetlands suitable for resting. The few fish that still remained were on the brink of disappearing. And here's the dry conclusion. An accidental lake created by humans unintentionally became an example of how the desert knows how to reclaim its territory. Humans let water appear where it wasn't supposed to be, and the desert showed that any water here is not a mighty force, but an extra element. If you manage it the wrong way, it turns the region into a danger zone. The lake hasn't evaporated completely. It still exists, like a huge but already sick body that lives on a mix of salts, chemicals, and engineering projects trying to save it. Now they're building wetlands, berms, and protective barriers. The state's pouring in hundreds of millions of dollars just to at least keep the dust on the ground. But whatever anyone does, the whole process is not salvation. It's an attempt to slow down the consequences of what happened a century ago. As we've already said, the Salton Sea is actively used for geothermal energy production, as well as for extracting minerals including lithium, which is so important today. It's genuinely useful in the 21st century, in the age of batteries. But do we really need to create several more Salton Seas in Nevada? Of course not, which is why the entire water project has to be very thoroughly planned.